Hi guys, welcome back to a Life of Medications podcast. Again, we're here for part 2 with Caroline and Dr. Cliff Harvey. We got cut off last time because my internet connection ran out. I think we just got to the point of talking about ketogenic diet and mental health, and then it just went mute. So if we, I was going to say, if we could pick up from there briefly, but then segue on to where we wanted to get to last time on to talk about the mushrooms. Because you've got a great little piece of information course on mushrooms on the site, and there's some very interesting little tidbits in there.
I think it's
so. Yes.
Sorry, go Keith. I keep interrupting you.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, my personal experience with the because. It's worth probably saying, and as you said in the last video, it's not a how to go foraging for mushrooms in the wild. This is a background on what the commercially available mushrooms, how they can benefit you. And I've been taking lion's mane for a couple of years based around brain health, and what I learned was post-concussive damage limitation, having played rugby for too long and got too many bangs on the head and continue to play. Yeah. So I'm really interested. I wasn't expecting to kind of read so much on it. But anyway, I've talked enough. How did you get into the mushroom world? How did you follow down that route?
It's a good question, because I had looked into it a fair bit in the early days of my clinical practice, right? So this is back in the 1990s, and we'd sort of started to look into some mushrooms, but really only in respect to sports supplementation. So at the time, cordyceps was coming out, right? And so a lot of athletes were using that, and there were, I guess, some suggestions that it can help to increase performance, reduce perceived exertion, increase your sort of oxygen carrying ability, maybe increase testosterone, things like that. And so we were pretty interested in that initially. But it was really only as a supplement. I wasn't really into fungi, mushrooms, mycology in the same way that I would be interested now. And then looked into it a lot more, particularly in the sort of traditional Chinese medicine realm, and maybe where some of these things overlap with traditional Indian medicine as well, when I was studying naturopathy. And this was, again, back in the probably early 2000s. And, it was quite interested in them, but certainly not to the degree I am now. It wasn't until many years later that my interest was re-sparked. And it was really it was predominantly through lion's mane, right? There were a lot of influencers who were starting, and I don't mean, your standard type influencers who are actually credible, were starting to really talk about the benefits they had experienced from lion's mane, and sort of remembering some of the stuff I had read a few years earlier, looking again at the research, I became quite interested in it. Like yourself, I've had a lot of concussions. I've probably had, I don't know, a dozen. I was put out of rugby because of concussions. I then took up boxing, which is the stupidest thing to do if you've just been put out of rugby. Took a few more hits to the head, and eventually ended up in jiu-jitsu and catch wrestling for that reason, so that I wasn't getting hit on the head anymore. But I've taken a lot of damage, had a lot of concussions, and that will, by virtue, mean you've had a lot of brain injury, right? So I wanted to try it myself. I tried it, got very good results. So that was really the lead-in, was lion's mane. Started using that a lot with traumatic brain injury patients, post-concussion patients, whether that was from sort of car accidents or, top line footy players, martial artists, boxers, all sorts, and got really good results. Now, we use that in combination with other therapies, but that sort of opened the doors to all of the other things as well. So I became more and more interested in mushrooms over the last probably 5 to 10 years.
So sorry to interrupt you there, Cliff. I just wanted to ask you, can you tell us some of the benefits? You mentioned that you did feel some good results from using lion's mane. What were they?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because I was just on a mushroom thread on Facebook just before, and a few people who were you know, considered sort of legitimate experts in particularly foraging mushrooms were saying that, well, a lot of the medicinal benefits, there's just not any evidence for that. And I disputed that immediately, because although these guys are experts in foraging and cooking mushrooms and things like that, they may not necessarily be aware of the breadth of research that's now out there. And so with something like lion's mane, Reishi Mushroom, we have a pretty good spectrum of research now, where it starts obviously in vitro in the test tube in the petri dish. We start to see cool stuff like it helps to regrow brain tissue, right? It helps to regrow neurons. But then we begin to see that translated through animal in vivo research, where they do actually horrible kind of studies on animals, but they are very informative, where they might make a crush injury, for example, on a mouse or a rat, and they'll crush nerves. And then they'll see that those that are supplemented with lion's mane, the nerves grow back way better, or they grow back at all, where they maybe don't in other subjects. But then we start to see human research, and we start to see that this occurs in humans as well. And then it functionally translates, and this is when it gets really interesting. It's not just about, well, it helps to regrow some neurons, but does that actually have an effect for me? Well, yeah, the research tells us it does, where we have improvements in cognition and memory, and you know, improvements in performance, maybe through reduced perceived exertion, but maybe also through other mechanisms as well. And there's a whole raft of health benefits. So in my experience, when I had seen all that research and I took it myself, I noticed that I did experience quite a big uplift in cognition, particularly. So focus, cognition, the ability to think clearly, and mood as well. And there is some good research now showing that it could be an effective treatment for depression. So there's quite a lot going on there. But I think when you see that breadth of research and you start to see more and more research emerging, you've kind of got the solidity there behind you that what you experienced wasn't just placebo. It's probably a real thing. So there are a lot of other mushrooms, obviously, in the course. We focus on a select few because they're the ones with probably the most evidence behind them right now, and they're the most commonly available. So we wanted to sort of make it easy for coaches, trainers, practitioners to understand a little bit more about those key fungi. So, you know, cordyceps, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, shiitake, reishi. Yeah, understand what those can be used for, what they are first and foremost, what their benefits are, what the dosage is, and if there are any safety or contraindication issues. So it really just allows people to be that little bit clearer about what's going on and how they might use these things for themselves or with clients or patients.
And when you say that you noticed the uptake or the kind of increased improvement in focus, how long did it take? Like, because I've taken it, and it's not like when you have an extra strong coffee, you feel the lift off. Well, that's what was your experience of it? Like, was it a few weeks? How could you measure that focus?
It's a good question, because I'm not sure how I could quantify it, except that I notice an effect fairly quickly, right? So if I take a big dose of lion's mane, I notice that. But as you suggested, it's not the same as if you're taking, you know, caffeine. You take a whole whack of caffeine and you're ready to go, right? You're fired up.
Yeah.
I find I take a big whack of lion's mane. I don't necessarily feel fired up, but I certainly feel very focused, very on. It's just that clarity of thought. And so, certainly notice that, and I notice it immediately. A lot of people do. Now, some people don't, and some people get more of a sort of chronic effect. We've also seen some people are non-responders, but we also need to kind of flesh out some of the dose effects as well. And maybe people aren't always taking enough to actually see a result, or, you know, there can be non-responders too.
Yeah, I just took one of those sachets from whatever company was selling them. I've got in my cupboard, and I just opened up a sachet, poured in.
Yeah, there's quite a few. I think
the Four Sigmatic, the lion's mane coffee. Yeah, see that, and that's interesting because a lot of people get a pretty good effect from that. Now, obviously, it's going to be synergistic with caffeine, and some people will say, well, it's the caffeine content that's doing it. But the caffeine content of those sachets is actually quite low. It's only about 40 mg. So it's about, you know, half a cup or less of a normal cup of coffee. So the caffeine content's not that high. The lion's mane content isn't actually that high either. From memory, I think it's about 400 milligrams. So that's a sort of low effective dose. Once people start taking maybe straight lion's mane powders or tinctures that have higher doses in them, they probably see a much bigger effect. So, you know, I'll take a full teaspoon of full lion's mane mycelium and fruiting body powder. And so that's a lot more, right? That's about, what, 20 times more? No, it's not. Someone else
it's a lot more for sure. There's not, there's not a lot in those sachets.
No, about 10 times more, right? Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, I'm really curious about reishi mushrooms, because they, when it comes to immune health, you hear it so much about reishi mushroom improving immune health. Can you maybe talk us or give us some insight into what you know about that?
Yeah, so reishi, it's one of the most, it's certainly not the most common mushroom. Shiitake is the second most commonly consumed mushroom after your sort of standard portobello, you know, calorie mushrooms. But reishi is a very common medicinal mushroom, and that's because it seems to have such a wide application. So we sort of, we simplify it down a little bit, and you're bang on. A lot of those effects are immune, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. So it's sort of seen as being the really broad spectrum one that you can use for a lot of applications. So in terms of general health, a lot of people just take reishi as a general health type tonic. So you might sort of consider, well, actually a guy who I follow, a researcher in the States called Bill Lagarkos, I remember him tweeting quite a while back. He said, lion's mane for the brain and reishi for everything else. Probably a pretty good way to look at it, because it has so much application for just improving systemic health and particularly for improving immunity. We see a lot of those crossover benefits with other mushrooms though. So for example, even from your standard culinary mushrooms, you know, just your plain old portobellos, there are quite profound effects on oxidation, inflammation in the body. From other mushrooms like chaga, you know, again, big effects with respect to oxidation, anti-inflammatory effects, a lot of effects that are, you know, that seem almost unbelievable. And I wouldn't want to put, you know, my hat completely on them, but there are studies that show, for example, that you can somewhat correct lipids and you can correct some of the diabetic markers and things through application of this. Now, I wouldn't say that they're going to be a cure-all for anything, but certainly
this is chaga.
Chaga, yeah. But in terms of being a range of very nutrient-dense foods that have a whole range of other application as well, they're very interesting. And the more you get into fungi, the more sort of fascinated you become by them, because they're very unique and very peculiar organisms. You know, they're unlike anything else we sort of think about, right? Plants.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I want to know what you mean by unique and amazing organisms.
Well, they're so integral to ecosystems, and we obviously know that everything is integral to the ecosystems they're involved with, but we often don't think about fungi so much, because we tend to think of them either as, you know, bad, fungus, mold, all that kind of stuff. You know, it's kind of breaking down, rotting stuff, or we think about them in the medical context, or maybe if we eat a lot of mushrooms, we think about them as an occasional food, but it's quite limited. Once you start to look at mushrooms and investigate them a little bit more and start to notice them, you know, we've been out walking in the bush every day for I don't know how long recently, and it's going into winter here. So we've had the autumn, we're going into winter. There's just fungi everywhere, right? And they're there to break down stuff. They're there to break down substrate, wood, you know, branches that have fallen off, trees that have fallen over, all these things. They basically break them down and return nutrients to the soil. They have symbiotic relationships with the plants that they're around. They can communicate with the plants. They communicate with each other. They have these huge mycelial beds often that run underneath the ground. You know, the biggest organisms on the planet are fungi. I think from memory, I think they're up in sort of Oregon and Washington State type area. You've got these enormous mycelia beds that run underneath forests. And they're basically a single organism that's communicating across that whole area. And so they're very interesting in that way, because they are so critical to what we need within ecosystems. If any of the people listening in follow Paul Stamets, they'll know that he's done a lot of really interesting work, for example, with bees. And this sort of hints as well at some of the potential health benefits, because he found that, you know, the old idea of Winnie the Pooh finding, you know, finding honey in these old trees that are hollowed out and whatnot. Those trees are obviously dying, or they've got dead material, and there's these fungi in there that are feeding on that. Now, people didn't necessarily think that this was a symbiotic relationship, but what he discovered, and I'm paraphrasing him here, so people have to go back to him as the primary source and see if this is all correct, but he discovered that there were antiviral compounds from the fungi that were involved with these bees that helped them avoid things like deformed wing virus and other viruses that affect bees, viruses that are killing a huge amount of the world's bee population. And that would be devastating, right? If the bees are gone, the theory is that we don't have long to live, because then all the pollination falls over, whole ecosystems start to collapse. And so there's the symbiosis between fungi and bees that helps to keep them healthy. And that's one of the reasons why that they live in such close proximity and they gravitate towards the same places. That's why bees will often use those. They're convenient, obviously, but there's also the co-opting there of those antiviral compounds from the fungi as well.
Yeah, it's so crazy. It's so crazy to think. I didn't Paul Stamos on Joe Rogan, just kind of mind the interconnection between when you go forage, you go just out into the local New Zealand, just head out to the mountains or to the hills.
No, we just forage in local parks. If we do go further afield, then, you know, we might go for a look in the bush up north, or, you know, on properties that, you know, family have. But lately we've just been walking through local parks, little bush reserves and things like that. And there's a lot of fungi out there, because I'm not an expert in any respect in terms of the foraging and the fungal identification and things like that. I'm learning as well, you know. So really my area, and this translates to nutrition, is that I am a researcher and practitioner, and what I do is translational research. So that's why I created that the functional mycology course, was to basically help practitioners to understand the application of the supplements that they can buy, that are pre-prepared, and how they would use those. And that's why we specifically say, if you're going to get into foraging, you've really got to, you know what you're doing and look into that a lot deeper. So I'm very, I guess I'm just a novice in that as well. But even at our level of skill, we can go out and find a whole range of edible mushrooms just within a 2-minute walk from our house.
Yeah, it seems like a very tricky enterprise to get into foraging. I read Michael Pollan's book, and he was discussing foraging as well, foraging for mushrooms, and how precise you need to be, because it literally is like a shade of a color difference, and you've stumbled upon a mushroom that might have some immune benefits to a mushroom that takes you on a very psychedelic trip or journey.
Well, that's not a bad thing. I don't think I would be more worried about, you know, a death cap or something like that. Because, because, you know, and that's why we don't want to understate that danger, because something like a death cap, you have one, and if you don't get to the hospital within, I think it's about 6 to 12 hours, you're in big trouble. You're going to die.
So right? There are mushrooms that are very dangerous.
Absolutely. And they can look a lot like either edible or psychedelic mushrooms in some cases. It's the, you know, it's often categorized as the little brown mushroom can be a real problem, because there are a whole lot that people might want to take for psychedelic purposes, depending on the area they live in, whether that's legal or I won't get into that too much. But there are also a lot of edible fungi that can look very similar to very poisonous ones. There are also ones that are sort of poisonous, but are considered to be the most deadly, and in fact they're not. Like the Amanita muscaria, which is fly agaric. You know the one I'm talking about? It's the classic toadstool. So it's red, usually red. It can be orange or peach and all sorts.
The Super Mario one.
Yeah, exactly. Red with white dots on it. Now, those can kill you, but you'd need to eat quite a lot. If you eat just, let's say, one, you'll probably get very sick. But they are a traditional food and a traditional medicine. And you just need to know how to prepare them correctly. So this is where it can become quite complex. And I think, with the exception of a few people, most people who forage for mushrooms that I know or know of, they typically tend to know very well a few types from their local area that they know they can identify with certainty. And if there's any lack of certainty whatsoever, you just don't put it in your mouth.
Yeah, that seems like a smart endeavor. I was going to say to you, moving away from the foraging aspects, if people really wanted to get into understanding how to use mushrooms in a supplemental way, what would your advice be to them?
Do the course.
Yeah.
Because it's not super, it's not very taxing in terms of the amount of information, but what I've done with that course is tried to provide exactly the amount of information people would need to know to safely and effectively use those common supplemental mushrooms. And we will be adding to that over time as well. So there are mushrooms now that are starting to emerge, within supplements, or you're starting to see a slightly wider range of mushrooms available. So we're going to keep adding modules to that. So the next one will probably be maitake. We may add Amanita muscaria. We may add some of these other things as well over the next few months. So it's a really good intro, at least. And if people want to use supplemental mushrooms or mushrooms in a supplemental way, it's a really good way to cut through the BS and just find the research. The only other way I would really suggest to do it is to jump online and get into the medical scientific databases and find all the research that I've already found for you.
Yeah.
So I've got a question in relation to COVID, because obviously we're on Zoom right now because of this. So it's a hot topic right now about finding things to improve your immune health and to make you physically and mentally stronger, so that if you do get sick, you're okay. What would you recommend in that regard in relation to mushrooms? How could people use mushrooms to, say, improve their immune health?
I think, in terms of supporting immune function, obviously we don't really have anything at the moment that has been proven to help with COVID specifically, but we almost don't need to worry about that specifically if we're thinking about supporting our immune function, right? And I think that's what's been lost in a lot of the conversations, is people are sort of saying, well, this particular thing or that particular thing hasn't been proven for COVID. And my position from the very beginning is, yeah, we know. And as soon as there are things that are proven for that, that'll be great. But there's nothing wrong with being as healthy and resilient as you can be. So I guess the question is, can mushrooms and fungi be part of that? And I'd say absolutely, because we have enough evidence that they can help to support immune function. And in that respect, I'd probably say reishi is really one that stands out for that. And because it's got a relatively, a very good safety profile. It's been used for a long period of time. It's generally regarded as safe. And it doesn't seem to have some of the fish hooks that maybe some of the other mushrooms do. So I'll mention one of those. Chaga is also very good. It's got very good anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties. There's evidence that it can help support immune function as well. The problem with chaga is if people are taking relatively high doses, it's also the food that we know of that's highest in oxalic acid. So oxalic acid is those, oxalates. They're linked to kidney stones and things like that. So you wouldn't want to take high doses of chaga for a long, long period of time. For a short time, it's great, or small doses, not a problem. But yeah, reishi stands out as one that you can probably use a little bit more consistently, and it has really good health supporting properties. But on that note, I tend to, I'm into them, right? So I have all sorts in my cupboard, and I will pretty much either cycle through them so that I get a broad range of, you know, mycological compounds that are known to support health. Or if I have a specific outcome that I want at that time, I'll take that mushroom. So if I'm feeling a little bit run down, you know, sure, I might take reishi, chaga, shiitake, or all of them. If I'm feeling like, you know, maybe I want to support my gut a little bit more, turkey tail is sort of considered one of the gut supporting mushrooms. Obviously for my brain, lion's mane. So, you know, it's not really accurate to say that they're only for a particular organ, but if you are targeting it a little bit, or for an organ or system, if you're targeting it a little bit, it means over time you end up getting a broad cross-section of benefits from a range of mushrooms.
Is there any contraindications in taking the mushrooms together? So for example, after I did your course, I got some reishi mushroom and chaga, and I was trying to make some elixirs. Is there any issues with mixing them together? Is there any contraindications for people?
Not as far as I know. There is a case report that we're investigating now of some damage to blood cells with high dose reishi use in a cancer patient. But, you know, I really don't think using normal supplemental type quantities, there's any problem with mixing and matching a little bit. But of course, you know, whenever we take anything, if we're taking much higher doses than are recommended, or we're taking a whole range of things together, it probably is worth doing a little bit of extra checking. But off the top of my head, I certainly can't think of any contraindications to mixing and matching the mushrooms, the common supplemental mushrooms, that is.
Of course, I think people need to be sensible irrespective. Particularly you hear things with vitamin C about taking vitamin C IVs, and you hear some of the research where people are taking very, very high doses, and there's obviously contraindications to that. So
yeah, and that's one of the that's one of the areas I think where I think more and more we're starting to see that there is a bit of a shift away from very high doses of specific things. You know, this is actually interesting in respect to mushrooms too, because a lot of people have focused on the beta glucans in mushrooms as being, you know, these active compounds, but they're only they're a tiny fraction of what is in any given fungus, right? And so we're really not getting the full spectrum of benefits if we're just focusing on that. Kind of like if we take a vitamin E capsule and we're only taking alpha tocopherol, we're probably not going to get the best effect, because people then tend to megadose on this one particular form out of 8 forms of vitamin E that we use in the body. And that's been shown to have negative outcomes in studies. Whereas when people are looking at a more like a food matrix and being replete in all those things we get from food, then we see better benefits. And typically in a lot of the research, what we're really seeing is the outcomes from things like vitamins and minerals are more related to helping people to be replete, or helping people to be at a good functional level of that particular vitamin and mineral, rather than a much higher dose than is normal giving a particular benefit. You know, look at zinc as another great example, particularly with respect to, say, where we're all at the moment and wanting to support immunity. Zinc is critical for immunity. But is megadosing zinc effective? Probably not. Like maybe in some certain cases, but probably the bigger issue is that, like in the country that I'm from, New Zealand, 25% of people are not getting enough zinc from diet. 40% of males don't get enough zinc from diet. So if we just take a cohort of people from the normal population and give them zinc, it's highly likely that a fairly large amount of them aren't getting enough zinc in their diet anyway. You're probably going to see a benefit. Plus, many of them are not getting what is optimal for not just survival, but, you know, to thrive. And so really, I think what we're moving away from a lot and seeing more and more in the research is that massive doses of particular things are probably less important on balance than making sure we're replete and getting a wide range of interesting compounds, not just the essential vitamins and minerals, but all those secondary nutrients we might get from, you know, brightly colored berries and richly colored vegetables, you know, fungi, weeds. You know, I forage for weeds as well, and they're fantastic and very nutrient dense. That was my first foraging experience. So when we're kids, we used to just eat, you know, weeds because our nan picked them out of the garden. And so I sort of learned to identify a lot of plants, edible plants. Now I can walk around my garden and basically get enough for a salad, just picking up weeds and things you wouldn't expect: fuchsia flowers, daisies, magnolia flowers, Kenilworth ivy, dandelion, puha, you know, all various types of sow thistle. It's just, there's so much.
You chuck them down on a plate and just dig into them.
Pretty much.
My dog is going to be so happy to hear that.
What was that, Keith?
Do you bet a salad?
Sorry, you frozen just there. What did you say?
Seeds and flour, like, do you put it in a blend?
I'm partially picking up what Keith's trying to lay down here. Yeah, a lot of it is, you know, a lot of those weeds are basically like salad greens, right? In fact, the original mesclun salad was based mostly on dandelion. So it wasn't rocket, or as they call it in the States and Canada, arugula. It was mostly dandelion. You know, dandelion and weeds of that type, what we now consider weeds of that type, were an incredibly common vegetable for people back in the day. Now, they're not as popular as other things now because they can be quite bitter. But as part of a mixed salad, they're fantastic. You know, dock grows everywhere, and that's, I think, better than spinach.
So your new course, Cliff, will be about weeds.
Thinking about it, yeah. It seems a really big topic because there are so many things that, you know, are edible. There's also obviously a lot that aren't, similarly to fungi. But we'll probably take the same approach. And, you know, I'm fully serious about this because it's not really about trying to cover everything. It's more so, it's almost like an expedition from my front door, maybe to the local park, and picking out all of those things that are edible. And a lot of them can be eaten with very little risk and are very easily identified as well.
Yeah. Do you know what's really interesting? And I know this, people might not like to hear this, but when my dogs get ill, I always see them go outside and eat the grass and eat maybe some plants. And it's always interesting to hear that old wives' tale, like, oh, they're eating the grass when their tummy's upset.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people think that is, you know, they'll eat grass or they'll eat weeds purely to make themselves sick, or purely to get a bit of roughage so that maybe they can pass things easily. That's only, I think, part of it. And like, I'm not a veterinarian, I'm not an expert in animal nutrition at all, but I've, you know, had dogs my entire life, and it's really interesting when you observe them that they won't just go out and eat any old thing. They'll sniff around, they'll look, you know, they'll basically figure out, and they'll find specific things and eat them. And in, you know, observing dogs over a lifetime, I've certainly noticed that it's not always just to throw up or to pass something. I'm sure that they're going out to find some extra nutrition as well, because dogs are obviously, they're omnivores. They're not obligate carnivores like a cat. They're predominantly carnivorous, but they do eat some vegetable matter as well. So they might eat some tubers or some, berries in the wild, all that kind of stuff. And they will eat some vegetable matter as well. And I'm sure it's not just for this old idea of fiber and roughage, which, we kind of get tarred with as humans as well. I get quite frequently attacked on Twitter for suggesting that people should eat vegetables. I know that sounds really weird, but there's a lot of people out there who say, well, vegetables are just water and fiber and they're useless. Just stick with your meat kind of thing. And I don't think that could be further from the truth. I mean, I think most of us accept that vegetables are good for us, but the main thing is that we're getting chemical signals. I think we talked about this last time, getting chemical signals from the environment, which help to switch on processes on a cellular level, because we're recognizing what happens in our environment, not just by being directly exposed to it through, sight, smell, the sounds we hear, the temperature, all that kind of stuff, but also the chemical signals that we're taking in by ingesting it as well.
Sorry, Keith, you're breaking up a little bit.
Carnivore diet.
I think Keith's the passive observer tonight. I think Caroline's got to be the questioner.
I don't. To be honest with you, my internet's not going so well. I got cut off at my house, so I'm sitting in a cafe now.
It's looking pretty good from where I'm sitting.
So all Zoom and internet things are in trouble these days. So I wanted to ask you, I know this is a little bit of a controversial topic, and it's related to mushroom supplementation as well. Recently, so I know that psychedelics have had a very, very bad introduction to the scientific world in the 60s and 70s, and now their reputation is changing a lot and people are a lot more interested in it. Do you have any information that you can impart to people about maybe the difference between supplemental mushrooms and psychedelic mushrooms, and is there any crossover? Is there any health benefits to taking the other side?
Yeah, I would say that the introduction to psychedelics in the sort of 50s, 60s, but before criminalization, was probably on balance pretty positive. And it was really the geopolitical environment which really put paid to that. So unfortunately, a lot of very promising research was stopped. And so that research has started to emerge again. And there are people doing research on, the let's say the classic psychedelics, particularly psilocybin mushrooms.
Yeah.
Yep. And LSD, obviously. And that there are there's emerging research showing that that potentially is very effective for a range of outcomes. So we have societal research, which suggests that people who have had a psychedelic experience are less likely to be involved in criminal behaviors or sort of, socially aberrant behaviors, going to jail or being addicted to drugs. It seems like a bit of a contradiction, but these are some of the outcomes that people see. There's a lot of emerging research showing that psychedelics could be very useful for intractable depression and bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress.
And particularly depression. I was reading some of the John Hopkins research on psilocybin and treating depression. And obviously you look at some of the other mushrooms as well, and they're there for depression and for anxiety. So they have similar benefits, but obviously very, very different physiological effects on the body.
Yeah, so there certainly is a lot of application for the psychedelics, and there will be a lot more research on that. I think we also need to consider that there were literally thousands of years of sort of case evidence and a traditional medical history using those things. LSD is a little bit of a new guy because it's synthesized predominantly, but the precursors are found in plants and they were probably used to some degree. But obviously there were other things that we used much more, like your psilocybin mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, ayahuasca, which contains DMT, peyote, San Pedro, cacti that contain mescaline. So there were a lot that we used for various purposes, and they're called entheogens for that use, right? So the entheogen is kind of the medicines, particularly plant medicines, that would expand the mind and allow people to achieve their human potential. So there was a lot of philosophical and religious stuff wrapped up around that, but really it was about helping people to have a different perspective, change their perception, and basically open up their minds and experience more. So now we're taking that into the medical realm, where people are beginning to look at the research on that and seeing that, yes, it can actually help for a lot of things. Now, we obviously need to be aware that in most places it's still illegal to do that. And that maybe the intention that has been taken into those things hasn't really been conducive to the best experiences, right? In a traditional setting, you would have a strong intention and you'd be thinking about using that to connect to something maybe greater than yourself, to have some insights, to have some epiphanies. Whereas if people just take a whole bunch of mushrooms and go to a nightclub, I'm not sure they're going to necessarily experience the same stuff. And so that's that's where context and environment are really important.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the difference between taking something recreationally, and here in this context, we're talking about taking things medicinally or for healing or therapeutic purposes. And I know in the research that I've read with Johns Hopkins, they were really, really stringent on set and setting, and having a therapist present and having a particular scene and a proper dosage and proper outcomes. And they were doing a lot of questionnaires before and after, and really assessing the impact and assessing the experience, and having somebody there to kind of walk them through that whole process. But how is your experience of, say, using, because if we think about mushrooms as a collective, there's such a huge range, and we just spoke about it very briefly, going from some of the mushrooms that can cause death, as opposed to some of the mushrooms that are just used in normal food purposes, and then there's other mushrooms that are used medicinally for supplements like lion's mane and reishi, and now we're moving into a very, very different type of mushroom that has a very different experience. So in that whole spectrum, what's your perspective on that? I know that's a very big question.
Yeah, I think that obviously any of the ones that we can safely ingest, to some degree, I think from my point of view, the outcome is the same. Now, what I mean by that is I'm a very big advocate for going beyond health, right? And that might seem strange because I'm a health researcher, I'm a clinical nutritionist. I research things that will benefit public health, but more importantly, it's about helping people to achieve their human potential. So a good example of that is the neurogenic, so basically the neuron enhancing neural repair effects of lion's mane are probably quite similar in many respects to the same effects that can be achieved through psilocybin mushrooms. The difference being that you don't trip out, and that's compelling to some people. You know, the trip is compelling to some other people, but you can still exercise some of the benefits without necessarily having that other experience. But by improving cognition and clarity of thought, and, you know, reducing depression and things like that, you're more likely to achieve your human potential. And that's a little bit distinct from health, because a lot of times nowadays we cling to this idea of health, and it's very arbitrary as being the end goal. But that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because health as an end goal is completely abstract. You know, if you could wake up tomorrow and be completely healthy in the sort of the way that you think about health, would that mean that you would be happy? And would that mean that you would actually be fulfilling your human potential? Of course it wouldn't, because what it would provide is just a platform from which you could actually do interesting things, you know, exercising your creativity, your passion, your purpose. And so I think that health is critically important to that, but there's also more. And that's why I think a lot of the research that I do in the coming years is going to be much more around those ideas of human potential and helping people to really thrive and have epiphanies and breakthroughs. And so, yes, it may cross over into some of those other areas as well, you know, particularly with psychedelics and entheogens. In fact, I will be writing a course this year on the medical application. So basically looking at the medical research that's been done on entheogens so practitioners can understand a little bit more about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of emerging research, and it's very interesting to read, because you see, is it Timothy Ferris, who was the Harvard professor in the 60s, who was also researching psychedelics.
Timothy Leary.
Timothy Leary, that's it, yeah. And he really took the research in one particular direction, and now you're seeing this huge wave of, particularly with microdosing as well, microdosing psilocybin, and then some of the other, and I think that is it London? They're doing that research in London about microdosing. Anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot, and there's been some good case evidence compiled over the years. There are some very, very legitimate researchers who know a lot about this stuff and have done a lot of work in this field. A guy I think that's fascinating to listen to is Denis Mckenna, who was Terence McKenna's brother, but he's a researcher, a doctor in ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology. So he's basically looking into those traditionally used entheogens and what their applications can be. And, it's fascinating because a lot of the drivers now of the research, but also the public awareness, they're very credible and legitimate people. Whereas even probably 10 years ago, you and I would not have been discussing this on a podcast that is geared towards the mainstream. But now people just accept this as being, well, this is something that could really be interesting for people's health, and more importantly, in the long term, for their human potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to ask you, because earlier we were discussing about dosing, and we were talking about dosing in terms of lion's mane, about taking high doses, and the idea of finding like kind of a little bit of a balance. And then moving over to psilocybin, and instead of taking these huge doses, about the microdosing aspects of it, is there any health or performance related benefits to microdosing?
Microdosing of psilocybin?
Yeah, in particular. So we discussed the benefits of microdosing, or actually normal dosing of reishi and lion's manes. And what about the inverse? Obviously, people take massive doses of psilocybin and go on a journey, but if they were to microdose, so that journey would be eliminated. Is there any performance or health related benefits to that?
Probably. I mean, there are a lot of, like I say, there's a lot of case evidence. I don't know if there is a huge amount of like published trial evidence, if there is any, on microdosing at the moment. I'd have to look into that and see if there is, but there's certainly a lot of case evidence that people are experiencing pretty profound benefits from microdosing. And I think I remember Paul Stamets talking about this sort of as if you could take a normal dose of lion's mane or a microdose of psilocybin and you probably get quite similar benefits. Now, I might be paraphrasing that, and it may not be 100% correct, but that was sort of what I took from one of the conversations with him that I listened to. And that kind of makes sense, because a lot of the neurogenic and clarity and cognition type benefits are probably going to be similar between a normal dose of lion's mane and a microdose of something like psilocybin.
Okay, so going back
but they are also different. So there will be differences in how they act as well.
So I was just going to steer away from the psychedelics and go back to normal mushrooms. Is there any other advice or suggestions that you can have for people if they were interested in exploring medicinal mushrooms? I know in your course it talks a lot about cognition and performance. Yeah.
So there's really, in terms of the benefits, they cross over a lot between the mushrooms too, and that's worth people remembering, because it's not as if, even though we simplify a little bit and say, well, we simplify to make it easier for us to understand and to know what we want to take in a given moment or whatever, but we also need to realize that it's a lot more complex than that. So when we say things like lion's mane for the brain, we also need to consider that lion's mane also has a lot of the other benefits that other mushrooms have in terms of reducing oxidation and inflammation, and maybe having potential in the realm of cancer treatment and things like that as well. So there is going to be a fairly broad crossover. And that's why I think we can mix and match a little bit, you know, change what we're taking periodically. I also think that's probably a good thing in terms of long-term safety, because although they do appear to be really safe on balance, taking something every single day of your life may not be the best thing to do. So occasionally mixing it up, you're going to get different compounds that are going to be beneficial. One thing I'd probably say is for people to be aware of the provenance of the mushrooms they're taking. So where are they from?
What do you mean by that? Okay.
Yeah, where are they from? How are they grown? What's the substrate? And can you be certain of the quality? Because fungi can be very good accumulators. They can be very good accumulators, particularly of heavy metals. And there is some suggestion, and I don't know whether this criticism is valid all the time, but there are enough experts in mycology who have said that some places in the world maybe you wouldn't want to get your mushrooms from. So some of the Chinese grown mushrooms, for example,
I see,
may not be that fantastic because of the heavy metals or other contaminants in the groundwater, and the mushrooms could potentially be accumulating those. So, you know, we are seeing, you know, we do a bit of work with a company in Australia that grows really good quality mushrooms, and they grow it on, you know, sustainable substrate, and they've got the highest, you know, quality standards. It's all sustainable. So we kind of know the provenance of the stuff that we're personally taking. So I think people should just look into that and make sure they're taking a product that is, you know, of a high standard, high quality. You know, if it's not growing in those types of conditions, at the very least, it should be tested so that it doesn't have all those heavy metals or other contaminants in it.
Is there any products that you would recommend in particular for people?
Well, there are some that I use. I need to disclose my conflict of interest though, because we were using certain products in practice here, and because they were difficult to get hold of, we started distributing them in New Zealand. So I work with Four Sigmatic, Life Cycle out of Australia, and they make a really cool ranges of pure mushroom powders and mushroom tinctures that you can take. So they're very easy to dose because it's basically just an eyedropper, and take a few drops. I nearly put that in my eye when I said eyedropper. You don't want to do that. And obviously the I haven't used it myself, but I hear really good things about Paul Stamets' brand as well.
Okay.
And I would expect for his product to be really good quality.
Keith, were you going to say something? I saw you moving and nodding there.
Am I even in? I've had audio held. I feel like I've just been a listening. Am I back in?
You're still there.
He looks almost like a 16th century painting or something. He's just sort of frozen most of the time. It's pretty cool. And I'm reading the Wolf trilogy at the moment, so it's very apt.
Yeah, no, look, I love it. I figured you guys can't hear me, so there's no point in the flow.
No, we could hear you were there. I thought you kept freezing a little bit, so I was like, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I could hear everything, but you guys are frozen every now and again. I really like what you said about the idea you could wake up tomorrow in optimal. Would that be the end goal? I think that's a really important concept for whatever kind of health you achieve. I really like that. Like, what to do then?
Yeah, and that's why the latest book I wrote was called The Credo, right? And it wasn't about nutrition. Actually, a lot of my books aren't about nutrition. They're about those things. It's about finding passion and purpose and creativity. And the reason is that when we become so hung up on these relatively arbitrary ideas of what we should be, particularly with respect to health, which is now so tempered by what we see on Instagram or Facebook. You know, we're basically trying to live up to these facades of what we consider health to be, but none of it's real. You know, it's not intrinsically driven. And so one of the big focuses in my clinical work and in my teaching is to also be talking about that stuff. You know, what's your why? What are the most important things for your life? You know, what are your values? You know, these are really important things. And then within that subset of things, what can you then do that is creative and purposeful and passionate to help you live a really good life? In the research setting, I'm really trying to push towards not just always looking at pathology, you know, not just looking at how do we treat this disease or how do we treat that disease or how do we get people back to normal, mundane, boring, on the treadmill health, right? How do we go beyond that to feeling amazing, to being amazing, to doing amazing things? Because I really think that has to be the outcome we're all looking for. It can't be anymore about just creating people who are healthy enough to go and work in a factory and be, you know, some normal member of society. I think we need to go far beyond that now, because we need people being happier, healthier, and creating really interesting solutions to the problems we have in the world. Now, the more people we have doing that, exercising their creativity, the better off we're going to be, and the more likely we are to actually get through a lot of the stuff that we see around us, whether it be pandemics or global warming or anything else.
So I know this is I love the notion of what you were saying about trying to be the best version of you and really having passion and purpose, and that encompassing human health and good health. Exactly. So when you mention things about Instagram, one of the things that I struggle with a lot is really finding out what the truth of an information of something is. Especially, so I was doing a little bit of research earlier about medium chain triglycerides and like coconut oil. And you find so much information on it. And half of the information is very positive, and then the other half is like talking about ill health and things like that. And so this is just one particular topic, but when it comes to nutrition, there's so many different opinions. It's so hard to sift through and to find out what's real. What would your advice be for people who are trying to navigate that? Because you've got Instagram on one hand, you've got just news articles that are very superficial, and then you have research that can often be paid for by certain organizations that have their own intentions and their own motives at hand. So how do people navigate finding good health and finding good information that really supports that genuine need for making people healthier?
That's a really good question. And I think that one of the big challenges we have is we now live in the post-truth era, right? Where it's really not so much about the evidence, it's about people's beliefs, and that begins to temper what conclusions they draw from the evidence. And so it can be very difficult. It's really difficult for people out there on the ground, because it's a minefield. So I think, I mean, I would really like to see there be a growth in scientific literacy, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But I think if people can at least try to understand that little bit more, that'll be really important. In the absence of having that maybe taught at schools and things, again, it's kind of difficult. But then we need to look at, well, who are we getting our information from? And there are more or less credible sources. I think if people are reading articles on scientific concepts, like, you know, medium chain triglycerides, they want to figure out, are they actually healthy for me? Or is coconut oil actually a beneficial thing, or is it a negative thing? If you're reading information on that, the best place to look is obviously in the scientific databases, but they can be very difficult to understand. You know, not everyone's going to be able to read easily some of those journal articles. So the onus falls on scientists, I think, to some degree, to start to demystify what they're putting out. So as an example of that, I've had a lot of conversations with my colleagues about writing scientific papers more simply. Now, not to the point where they're not going to do the job, because you need to use certain jargon and conventions and things like that. But sometimes we fall into the trap of being too smart. We'll use a word that no one but a handful of people in the world will understand. Like, and it's basically only a group of, say, 30 people who do the research that we do are going to understand that. That's ridiculous, because if there's another word that can explain that as well to those people, but also to a million people out there, that's the word you use. So I think we need to start to simplify how we communicate the science. I think there needs to be proper translation of research into mainstream articles. The problem at that point is that a lot of journalists don't understand the science well enough, so they're not translating it well. A lot of researchers have biases where they will basically promote a conclusion from a paper, which isn't really what the paper said. It's because it fits with their bias. So how do we get through that? I think it comes down to trying to sift through the sources of information you get, find credible, pragmatic people in particular areas and follow them, because you know they're going to be looking at the evidence at least more objectively and trying to put that out there. The more pragmatic people are, the less they're going to be extremely controversial. You know, people would say that I was controversial because I was using low carb and ketogenic diets back in the 90s. And that's what I did my master's and doctorate and all that kind of stuff in. But if anyone reads my articles, I guarantee they'd say, it's a pretty pragmatic guy, because I'm not saying that keto and low carb is for everyone. What I'm saying is that there are certain applications for which it's really good. And there are also people who thrive on high carb diets, and there's all this stuff in between. And a lot of it rests on how your body works, what your requirements are, what your health conditions are, but also what your psychosocial stuff is like. What behaviorally can you stick to? What culturally is appropriate to you? All these various things, right? So it becomes very much, there's no clear answer, but there are certain things that we all agree on. Like in nutrition, everyone agrees that we should eat more unrefined food instead of ultra processed food. Almost everyone, with the exception of carnivores, the carnivore diet crowd, thinks that we should eat lots of vegetables, right? So there are a lot of things that really fit. And therein lies the commonalities that people get results from. Now, there's a lot of people who are talking about that stuff, and they also understand that there's going to be some minor differences, but they're not clinging to those because there's no point battling. So find credible people and follow those. And I guess, be wary of people who are making grandiose claims or claiming that one diet fits all, or that one particular food is going to kill you. That was probably a long-winded answer. It's a difficult question to answer.
It's a great answer. It's just, you're right. It's a minefield. It really is a minefield. Yeah, it's almost like these days you have to peel back 3 layers to really understand, oh, okay, is this unbiased information or is this opinion information? And that's what I find more and more these days.
There are people out there as well that I think are worth following. You know, I have an enormous amount of respect for the guys behind MASS. If people are into fitness or strength conditioning, hypertrophy, the guys behind the MASS Research Review, you know, Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Eric Trexler, Dr. Mike Zerdos, Greg Nuckols, those guys do a fantastic job because they're extremely pragmatic and they're always evidence-based and holistic. You know, there's other guys out there like Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition, great podcast, great articles. I don't always agree with him, but hey, it doesn't matter if I don't agree with him because I know he's putting out good information. And that's the thing, you know, a lot of the people who are pragmatic, evidence-based and holistic, they don't agree on everything, but they understand why they're having a disagreement. They're not so stuck in their ideas that they can't see, oh, I can see why you think that. I disagree, but that's cool because we agree on most of the most important stuff.
Yeah, I think what I find quite interesting about this is obviously Keith and I are a little bit educated when it comes to these things, but for most lay people, it's such a minefield to be able to navigate. So it's challenging. It's very challenging. So appreciate all your good efforts and the recommendations.
Well, we can all do better too. You know, I do a little research review that I put out every month, and I've been told by a few of the people who subscribe to it that, dude, sometimes it's just too heavy. So I need to put layers in. You know, there needs to be this layer where everyone's going to understand it. And if they want more, they can go that little bit deeper. So you kind of need 3 layers to things, but it's important that the most relevant information is able to be translated through every layer in the way that people are going to understand. And I guess something here that's really important as well is I think it needs to be translational. In other words, there needs to be application, right? So you read a lot of things that say, oh, this is really bad, or this is really good, or this is the science behind whatever. And often it's not anyway, but then there's no take home message. There's nothing that you can actually do with that. And that's what I think is critically important, is we can debate till the cows come home about various aspects of the science behind nutrition. But if people are still left not knowing what to do, we're wasting our time, because all we're doing then is, self-flagellation. We need to be helping people. And the only way you help them is to give them simple things that they can actually do and do right now and continue to do that will improve their health, their happiness, their performance.
Yeah, for sure. On that note, I think, Cliff, thank you so much for your time. Keith, you're still so quiet down there. How can people follow you if they have any questions, or if they want to follow your social media?
Easiest way to find the various things I do, including all my social, is just to go to cliffharvey.com. So that's just my name.com. And there you can find the links to my various social and to my monthly research review and to all the member-only articles at the site. You can view all the member-only articles anyway. They're just limited to time, so you can read one premium article a month. So if you want to keep coming back, you can get it all.
Amazing. And Keith and I have both done some of your courses, and they're amazing. So we're a little bit of a testimonial there to some of the great information you're putting out there. So thank you for making things a bit clearer.
And people can obviously do those courses through you guys as well.
Yeah, amazing.
Awesome.
Keith, do you have anything to add there?
Off your time, Cliff. Really appreciate it.
Okay, amazing. On that note, now that Keith is frozen, let's head off. Thank you so much, Cliff, for everything.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Okay, bye.